Typically, a historical artifact or culturally significant work refers to an object or creation that has encapsulated the spirit of an age, or perhaps marked or influenced a generation in a memorable and unique way, sometimes becoming symbolical and indissociable from that specific period. Hence, there are certain films that can be aptly classified as such, and are often seen as representative of an epoch or a way of thinking belonging to it. Every country has at least one film that can be characterized as especially emblematic and as having captured and successfully described the stage of its history, and Kyrgyzstan is no different. In this video, assembled in collaboration with Kyrgyz National Film Studio named Tolomush Okeyev and the Department of Cinematography of the Ministry of Culture, Information, Sports and Youth Policy of Kyrgyzstan, Plan-Séquence is glad to present what is generally considered to be the country's finest cinematic achievement, a film that is held by its native populace as carrying its essence and soul like no other in the country, the sky of our childhood. Although known internationally as The Sky of Our Childhood, as a direct translation from the Russian title conceded to it for easier distribution and acknowledgement in the Soviet Union, this scintillating 1966 film is actually originally named Bakai's Pasture and was directed by Tolomush Okeyev, who is considered by many to be one of the greatest filmmakers, if not the most significant cinematic figure in the country's history. Davlat Nazarov, the notorious Tajik filmmaker turned activist and politician, once jokingly affirmed, though not without a certain sincerity, that the way Karl Marx's Capital left an impression on the communists, and the way the Holy Quran is close to the Muslims, is comparable to how sacred Bakai's Pasture is for the directors of Central Asia. As noted in the previous video on Shepitko's Heat, Andrei Konchalovsky's The First Teacher and The Sky of Our Childhood are generally taken to be the first two films that firmly and honorably placed Kyrgyzstan in the minds of the cinema audiences. According to Michael Rowland, a historian of Central Asia who has published various works on the region's cinema, culture and identity, The Sky of Our Childhood, which had its premiere in 1966, together with Bulat Mansurov's The Contest released in 1963, marked the rise of poetic cinema in Central Asia, even though Kyrgyz cinema had already by then a nascent documentary tradition possessing a strong lyrical bent, a current spearheaded by none other than Okeyev himself, Boltbek Shamsiev and Melis Ubukeyev, three remarkable Kyrgyz artists that would forever change Kyrgyzstan's cinematic landscape with their fiction films. Okeyev is a ubiquitous name in the country's film scene, and by extension an influential and recognizable character in not just Central Asia cinema, but in the whole of Soviet cinematography. His name will be familiar to viewers who've watched the previous video on Larisa Shepitko's Heat, as the work marks a watershed moment in Kyrgyz cinema, acting as the first major project for many renowned Kyrgyz faces, including Bolotbek Shamsiev and Okeyev too, who had worked as a set sound engineer during production. This first professional contact with filmmaking, straight out of the Leningrad Institute of Film Engineers, now known as the St. Petersburg State Institute of Film and Television, deeply impressed the young Tolomush, sitting attentively in the sound truck. In his own words, "I have to admit that it was working with Larisa that awakened in me a genuine love for film work. I realized then what a difficult, complex and at the same time noble labor it is, requiring you to devote all your moral, spiritual and physical resources and skill, patience and struggle, and how beautiful is the moment of victory." Before Bakai's Pasture, his feature film debut, Tolomush had already displayed a distinctive vision with his exquisite 10-minute documentary short known in the West as Horses, or These Are Horses, a visual poem in which the landscape, people and horses of Kyrgyzstan are recorded with supreme acuity and sensibility, oftentimes in a fashion that resembles what Shepitko had done a few years earlier, having deeply impressed the people who watched it, with many noting its raw power, skill and kind attitude towards the graceful four-legged animals. This promising first directorial sample had been made during Okeyev's studies in Moscow, now specializing in direction and screenwriting, and it was during this period that he met with Chingiz Aytmatov again, the two having first acquainted themselves only superficially a few years before in St. Petersburg. Aytmatov, if you recall from the video on Heat, was a major literary figure on the country's modern history, although when him and Okeyev first got to know one another, they were still many years away from attaining the status they possess nowadays. In any case, the two young men, separated by a few years of difference, immediately hit it off, with Ptolemy sharing with one interviewer at some point later that what we discovered about each other was that our point of view, our soul was the same. On the other hand, Aitmatov is quoted as saying, Ptolemy Shokayev, firstly, will go down in history as one of the directors who laid the foundations of Kyrgyz cinema and raised its level of professionalism, and secondly, his feature film debut, Bakai's Pasture, shall remain a classic of the film industry of Central Asia. Bakai's Pasture, like many classic Kyrgyz films, is an adaptation of one of Aitmatov's stories, whilst at the same time bearing a strong autobiographical strand in regards to Akayev, the former having lived during a time of great transformation in the country, from a somewhat underdeveloped and neglected region into a modern Soviet republic, and that being one of the central themes of the film, whilst the latter mentioned that he felt very close to the film's plot since he was born and raised in ecological pastures similar to the ones depicted on the film, whilst adding that, I was born in a yurt. Since childhood I have seen how mares and cows are milked, how meat is cooked, prominent aspects of nomadic and country life that come to the forefront of the picture just as well. During his infancy, he lived far away from urban centers, he was surrounded by natural beauty and didn't go to the movies, theatre or art exhibitions, so, as he said in one interview, I was taught and raised in a way by the majesty and beauty of nature. There was folklore, songs, epics, ancient legends. I was lucky. Time and time again, I heard the wonderful comus players, folk storytellers. For me this was the highest academy for introducing me to art. If one had to describe the film's essence, one could say that it is a requiem of sorts, a new eulogy for the rapidly changing country of Kyrgyzstan in the face of modernity. Perhaps a laudatory song expressing the love and already the longing for its long-standing and balanced way of life and worldview that pursued and integrated the existence of man and his land, that exalted the humble, inspiring and fruitful intercourse between mankind and nature, a perspective in which both can coexist peacefully, symbiotically, without falling into a widespread colonizing, resource-exhausting mindset. On a dramaturgic level, its plot concentrates on a young boy called Kalik, studying at school in the city far away from home, that comes back to the Kyrgyz meadows where he was born and used to live, to spend the summer holidays with his nomadic parents, his father Bakai and mother Urum, who get by as they always did, through horse breeding. Whilst initially things seem to take place as the typical visit home during summer break, soon the mood changes as Bakai reveals his intention to keep his son by his side to follow the same lifestyle despite Kalik's reluctance, and the conflict soon unfolds. Kalik enjoys his life in the city and wants to keep studying and eventually find a job. He desires to become a developed individual, living a modern life and enjoy the urban amenities, whilst Bakai wants him to help in their family tradition and work, to follow his footsteps, inherit and maintain his horse-based livelihood. In addition to that, there's the pressing issue regarding the family's imminent departure of the pasture due to the plans to build a mountain road across it, with the arrival of the Soviet construction team compounding the pressure of the whole situation. What follows is a generational clash that will expose the fracturing struggle that Kyrgyzstan was facing at the time, with the progress infiltrating and challenging the ancient and traditional ways of life. The film is a graduation project of the then 30-year-old director, and was shot in Suzamir's pasture between 1965 and 1966. Just like in Heat, the filming conditions were not the easiest or most welcoming, and the initial plan was to shoot in Isikul as per the original story, but unfortunately the Kokomaran river had suffered a flood by then, like many other Kyrgyz watercourses, overflowing its banks and forcing the cast and crew to settle in Suzamir instead. In there, a contagious viral epidemic broke out at one point, whilst the crew's yurts happened to be blown away by the harsh winds more than once, but the team's drive and commitment were unabashed, and production managed to wrap up within the schedule, surprisingly. Amidst the film crew, playing Bakai, Urum and Alim, one finds Muratbek Rizkulov, Aliman Dzangurozov and Sovietbek Shumadilov, all stars of Kyrgyz theatre already at the time, and actors that would be featured in almost all of the great classic Kyrgyz films of the era, such as White Mountains, Shot at Karash Pass, Jamilia, The Ferocious One, and Descendant of the Snow Leopard, with Rizkulov also appearing in Eldar Shengelai's Legend of the Ice Heart, Grigory Chukhrai's The 41st, and Andrei Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev. Despite this great main trio of actors, one finds a wonderful surprise in Kalik, played by a young teenager named Nazreddin Dubashov, with a convincing performance that captivated audiences all over the world. Adding to this star-studded cast, the film also features outstanding artists such as the director of photography Kadirjan Kidiraliev and composer Tashtan Yermatov, the former being a talented VGIK graduate who went on to shoot almost all of Okayev's films and rightfully earned the admiration and respect of his peers due to his remarkable ability to reify and convey the essence and themes of the scripts he laid his hands on, whilst the latter became one of the most recognizable and awarded composers in the country, attaining fame all over the Soviet Union with his music written for films, documentaries, and various artistic performances. As one would expect, and like other films featured in this channel, the end result, given this congregation of assorted talented and inspired individuals, could only result in a work that was nothing short of memorable, and quite rightly so. Not only did the audiences within and beyond Kyrgyz borders acknowledge it, but the film also received awards in festivals in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, Tashkent, Uzbekistan, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, Trieste in Italy, and Frankfurt am Main, Germany. Notwithstanding its numerous awards and rewarding reception by the general public, the feedback amongst specialized critique and Soviet authorities was mostly superficially complimentary, as the positive reactions usually assessed the film merely as the typical struggle between the old and the new tenets, with progress winning against old-fashioned ways. Although Okayev confesses that the scene where the grandmother expresses sadness for her grandchildren speaking Russian instead of Kyrgyz landed him in hot water with the censors, leading to an accusation of being anti-Russian, and in one interview he reveals that officials at Goskino were unsatisfied with his non-judgmental objectivism and would have preferred a stronger didacticism and social rhetoric. The officials were not extremely fond of Okayev, as he was taken to be an independent mind with clear, strong ideas and a sharp tongue and keen intellect and humor, which came across to them as a threat to the standard civilian Soviet meekness and conformism. And were it not for the fact that the film came out during that long-expected respite in Soviet politics known as the thaw, which has been talked about extensively in other videos, the Kyrgyz director would have probably gotten in a serious predicament. Indeed, although Bakai's Pasture is breathtaking in its visual representation of Kyrgyzstan, with truly mesmerizing cinematography comprised of lofty imagery and technical rigor, and compelling all the way through in its geographically confined but richly woven narrative, the film is also ripe with nuanced ideas and Okayev's own insight into his country's history, land, language, and time. There is a clear dialectic structure between the old and the new world, as mentioned earlier, whilst presenting an acute cultural sensibility that subtly expresses a ponderous and valid concern. Despite the apparent circumscription of the plot, Okayev manages to rebrand this classic tug-of-war between the past and the future into an understated epic narrative that invites viewers to take a deeper look into this crucial period, one which has been described by many people as an ecological parable, which might be a perfectly apt description considering Okayev's own thoughts about it. In The Sky of Our Childhood, I wanted to deal with the problem of the collision between nature and civilization, and I did it because this problem worried me terribly. The way this issue affects the director is discernible through the power harnessed by a handful of episodes that are memorable by not only how they are framed from an aesthetic standpoint, but especially by what they faintly whisper to one who's watching and listening closely, such as for example when Bakai finally leaves the pasture for the construction workers to get on with their work, and his tamed golden eagle is set free but is unable to leave them, as it appears to not only have forgotten how to fly, but also immediately returns to her perch and seems reluctant to abandon it, as if umbilically if invisibly attached to it, which could perhaps be taken as an analogy for Bakai himself, who wished to remain in the pastures in which he lived for what could have been centuries, but once forcibly released from it, now finds himself uncertain of what to do or effectively unable to carry on the same way as he did before. It's an incredibly poignant scene, since the audience clearly perceives how much it pains him and how much it means to him leaving the land which he was accustomed to visit and return. He is coerced into relinquishing a part of his life which he hoped would remain unchanged and unchallenged, and to make matters worse, he must also bear the disappointment of witnessing his offspring refusing to perpetuate the legacy of him and their forefathers. Soon, this pristine, ancient and venerable meadow will be permanently remodeled. Construction workers will come to blow up its rocks, carve its grassy soil with their shovels, pickaxes, tractors, bulldozers, and this progressive Soviet crew is, according to Okeyev himself, constituted of smart people who want to immediately sweep away the old, seeking to move towards the new age, forgetting the human cost of the old. In their minds, we must leave behind the memory of our fathers who raised and fed us. Of course, the construction of the road changes the appearance and psychology of the mountain people, and indeed, civilization often penetrates carelessly, destroying the beauty of the earth, unfortunately. They are likely thinking, why would we need ugly land? To him, modern life and its aggressive, intolerant and ruthless modes of human existence that relentlessly strive for progress, regardless or even unconscious of its effects on the pre-existing conditions, structures and souls, are an active threat not only to places such as the Pasture portrayed in the film, but also to the inhabitants themselves as well, and this surely explains the aged director's lament in a 1986 edition of The Art of Cinema magazine, one which strikes a chord today just as strongly if not more even than back then, now that we're inching every day closer to a massive ecological tragedy. I remember easy cool as it was during my childhood. I remember what grass and pastures, animals and birds were around. Much of this has faded into the realm of memories. Easy cool is becoming shallow, and this is a problem on a global scale. This is perhaps the reason why the sky of our childhood is perceived nowadays as the perfect embodiment of Kyrgyzstan's self-perspective and a prime example of its cultural legacy, acting also as a little time capsule too. On a small side note, one cannot help but smile thinking of how him and Tarkovsky would have bonded, given their similar outlook on the ecological state of affairs back then. Something which does not come entirely off as a surprise, knowing that Tarkovsky is found in the scriptwriting credits for another film by Okeyev, the ferocious one. Another particularly affecting moment in the film comes closer towards the end, when Bakai is seen beating his wife after a quarrel erupts. Bakai seems especially incensed, perhaps due to his frustration regarding the disintegration of his world, and maybe the scene might not have been entirely unusual or upsetting in such a typical patriarchal rural community. But the unexpected element here that proves to be a crucial point in the narrative is the fact that Kalik, in an attempt to protect his mother, turns against his father and hits him in the back with a wooden lasso pole used to catch mares called ukuruk. At this moment, Bakai is somewhat taken aback, for, in his mind, how could the boy, his son, dare to stand up against him, still barely an infant to his eyes? Such unprecedented act reflects a severance with established immemorial familial law, in a way much like the tractors and bulldozers permanently furrowed, demolished and drilled the hills and meadows against the sacred statutes of the land and nature. For a brief moment, Bakai freezes and in his eyes glistens a multitude of thoughts and emotions. He's definitely surprised, bewildered, although not necessarily offended, perhaps annoyed or displeasured by this unexpected rebellion by his supposedly submissive offspring. And yet, at the same time, there seems to be space for a revelation of sorts, an acknowledgement of Kalik's emancipation and individuality, an admiration for his son's brave and unforeseen statement of self-reliance. And it is this scene that allows for the film's epilogue to work so effectively in its moving character, for as Kalik is returning to school for his next year, after having parted with everyone but his father, he assumes there won't be a proper farewell between the two. In Kyrgyz nomadic culture, the father figure is extremely important, and such a display of insubordination or non-conformity as we've witnessed from Kalik could be seen as highly disrespectful and worthy of severe punishment, hence why Bakai ran after him with a whip following his insurgency, and this would explain the astounding Kalik's nightmare scene whilst he's safeguarding the colts. Maybe Kalik now thinks he got disowned by Bakai and is never meant to see him again. But then, Bakai emerges in the distance and he meets his son. Despite the sobbing of the child, he's not only not mad at him, but even grants him some money which he had saved for his retirement for Kalik to buy textbooks, kissing his son with a warm send-off. Bakai seems resigned with his fate, with the fact that his children will not inherit his herd and pasture, that will study and live in the city, speaking Russian instead of Kyrgyz. He has stoically accepted the dictum imposed on him from above. It's an arresting scene of great, raw and profound humanity, one of those moments that transcend the medium and which touch the viewer's soul, binding artist and spectator into a tight-knit, wordless and timeless comprehension, one which is transcendently crowned by the richly symbolic final scene in the film, in which the slow ascent up the mountain of the remaining nomadic elders is contrasted by the galloping of the young children into the blinding light of the modern tunnel that will take them back to school and into civilization. The Skies of Our Childhood, often mentioned as the brightest of all films of the Kyrgyz miracle, is an exceptional and unforgettable film that doubtlessly rings particularly close to Kyrgyz hearts, as a cinematic creation that encapsulates and enshrines a period marked by the vanishing of the country's culture, trading seats with modernity. It draws on the same lifeblood that permeates the paintings of Semyon Chuikov, the father of modern Kyrgyz art, the pictures of which showcase the same impassioned infatuation and utter reverence towards the Kyrgyz people and its land, works in which the immense, imposing, everlasting skies that constituted the childhood of many Kyrgyz generations manifest with unshakable sacred assertiveness. The film is therefore comprised of an acute longing and providing a sense of nostalgia that may be hard to fathom for foreign viewers whose cultural roots may lay in distant regions of divergent history. Nevertheless, its power relies not only on what it offers to those acquainted with its language, landscape, myths and traditions of Kyrgyzstan, but also on what it says about the world we live in and in the ravishing way it does that. And in this sense, it can be duly classified as a veritable work of art that overcomes linguistic and geographic barriers that ought to be seen by all cinephiles. This video was made possible by the support of Kyrgyz national film studio named Tolomushokeyev and by the Department of Cinematography of the Ministry of Culture, Information, Sports and Youth Policy of Kyrgyzstan. Please visit their websites for additional information, links will be on the description. Expect more explorations of Kyrgyz cinema in the future too. I also would like to thank Abner Valenzuela. Your support on Patreon is valuable and highly appreciated, as it helps with the research and production of future content for this channel. I thank you all for listening and hope to see you next time.